in combat with stuff like that, I've always thought about every frame. I want anyone to hit pause or take a screenshot and have it be a cool screenshot.
This is an interview with Lee Davis. Lee is a video game animator, perhaps best known for his melee combat animations in The Last of Us Part 2. We talk about his directing motion capture and his inspirations and process when animating combat.
I mean, maybe we start a little bit earlier on. Was there something that made you realize, like, I want to be an animator?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to like the mid 90s when I was a young teen. It was kind of the emergence of CG film, like fully animated features like Toy Story and basically rise of Pixar and stuff like that. For whatever reason, I was a young artist. I was kind of always into art. That was fascinating and kind of drew me. And but the access that I had to it as a young teen was somewhat limited. I went to a pre-college program at Ringling School of Art and Design, which was at the time kind of one of the lead like recruiting centers for Disney. They were one of the few schools at the time that had like an active computer art department, basically. So that was in Florida. I mean, funny thing about that is that I got my hands on Amiga early roster graphics, like pixel animation. Basically, it wouldn't be until I was actually in school at the Savannah College of Art and Design, maybe late second, early third year, that I would even really get my hands on anything tangible. And that was Maya. It was like the third iteration of Maya, I think, at that point. But that's how I started with animation. And then even at that time, the approach for most schools and my peers and for anyone trying to get into computer art at that time was the way it was engineered was more for like a generalist kind of structure, where like they taught you all the aspects of it. My senior project, for example, I had to do storyboards, build the set, textures, lighting, character rigging, the whole and animation. There was one class that I had with the like a recent grad student, taught for a couple of years, and ended up going off and working in games and film and stuff. And I think he's still doing that to this day. But kind of made the animation side of things exciting, and the fundamental kind of aspect of animation, the fact that it's movement, I think is why I lean towards it. And my friends that I was working with at the time that ended up becoming animators, they all kind of felt the same way. It was like you got to get up and kind of act your shots out, and it was action. Whereas most other parts of computer art are somewhat still and stagnant. If you're building a character, it's staying still. If you're building a set, if you're doing any other type of art, concept art and all that stuff is basically kind of still shots, where animation was making things move. So it's really what it comes down to. Even after I graduated, I will say that even then, even though that was kind of what I was into, I did kind of fall into it professionally, because I was at a point where I could have been a character artist, or I could have modeled things. Like my skill level was about the same, I'd say, with animation as just being a CG artist. But it really was the opportunity that came along after being out of school for a while. I took an animation test at a young, well, it wasn't really that young, but it had been around for a little while, but it was an independent studio that was hiring some students that, recent grads that I knew from my school. And I took a test, an animation test, and ended up landing a gig as an animator. And that's really how it really all started, my professional career, at least. And why I became a specialist it was a game called Blood Rain 2, but she was a Dampier, so she's a half vampire, right? Half human, who had retractable big swords blades that would retract on her arms. She could slice people into bits, and it was kind of almost like comical gore, where you could chop somebody's head off and it'd be a fountain of blood, like Kill Bill style. The test that I took to take the job in the company was basically like, hey, take rain and do a combat move. I think it was a finisher. So it was like I had a little battle and a kill from there. And that's like literally how I got my start in the industry. So we did that game. I did Aeon Flux for the movie because they had this relationship with Paramount MTV at the time. It was kind of a cool, like, it was a different take on anime a little bit. It aired on MTV in the liquid television days in the 90s. But that was over the top anime combat. So we kind of tried to emulate that in the game. So yeah, so I mean, I've done different things in gaming, but if I look back at most of the years that I've spent has been on close quarters combat, really.
If you had to guess as to what major animations stand out in the Blood Rain demo, what do you think it would have been?
Well, I don't want to say that I stole it, but I borrowed some choreography from wasn't it called Blade?
Blade was 98. Is that about right?
Yeah, Blade, right? Vampires?
Yeah.
There was this one sequence that I guess he must have had some swords, and I kind of like, so I had some actual choreography, like that I didn't come up with, but I was trying to emulate that. So I think it was like the choreography. It was, obviously I had to like just show that I had sensibilities for timing and weight and that kind of stuff. I think that's must have been what did it. I mean, I think I never got to see other tests that they got. I was told that was the best one that they saw, but I don't know what else they saw in order to really compare it,
When you're going from Wesley Snipes to a video game character, is it a one-to-one rotoscope? What do you do?
So in that instance, it's the thing about movies, and probably and even in that one, it's rarely in action scenes. They're cutting a lot usually. Like there's a lot of cuts, and they're going more for like a feeling that you get from watching the scene rather than an actual real life representation of like how the entire sequence would go down. Sometimes you have longer shots, of course, and because in games in general, one of the things that you find pretty consistent when you're in early stages of like developing IP or going trying to define the direction for the look and feel of something is that they'll look to movies. It's pretty consistent because if you look back at like my years at Naughty Dog, had Uncharted. Well, Uncharted is like clearly looking back at old like film noir. It's looking at Indiana Jones. But you watch those movies and you see a lot of cuts usually, right? Camera shake and steady cam, and if you think about what the sequence was, you think you knew what would happen, but a lot of stuff is kind of implied or off screen. So with a scene like that, you have to kind of fill in the blanks. So what the feet are doing, like what even most of the body parts of like the opponent in any given moment, like that's kind of stuff you basically kind of have to fill in blanks because it's in games you don't, especially with gameplay, you never get that technique, right? Because your camera, depending on what type of game it is, your camera's most, in pretty much all instances, like showing all the action. For me, at least, is a lot of it going from real life or movies to video games is a lot of that is timing, especially if you have actions on the controller. Players usually want things to be a lot more responsive than they are in real life or in live action. If we're getting mocap basically working from live action, one of the first things that you have to do for a kick and a punch and any kind of strike is a timing pass, and you're usually you're making things a lot quicker than they are in real life, even if you're going for a grounded realistic experience. Something about the synapses in people's heads when you press the button, when you see stuff on screen, the expectation, the satisfaction of it all. If you're going with real world physics, it feels very sluggish and slow. That like kind of general aspect of the whole thing has been pretty consistent through, different types of games that I've done.
So
Yeah.
aside from the speed change, is there anything else that you use to accentuate movement when going? And of course, there's a difference between keyframing and mocap, but since we're on the topic of mocap, what else are you looking for in a performance that can help you as an animator?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I mean, with most of this, what my experience and my knowledge has been gained from, my years at Night Dog, Nathan Drake and Joel from The Last of Us, and Ellie and Abby. I'll tell you one, like, just give an example. One of the things that we had to learn a couple different times is the telegraphing attacks. We had a period of time on the second Last of Us where we were, because Ellie was our new main character, and so we were approaching things like, well, what's her strength? The guy that you played in the first game was kind of a bigger guy. We were going for like a real, visceral, grounded street fighting feel, and so we kind of lost early on this feeling of basically the anticipation and like telegraphing of attacks on the player's side. If you press a button and you just immediately kind of jab with a switchblade, that there's a lot that's lost there. If you're working with, say, like somebody who's had a lot of martial arts training, or even choreographer, if you're doing things by the book. I mean, if you're in a fight, right, you don't want your opponent to know that they're going to be attacked. The point is to get it in there, and so then they don't evade it or block it. But in at least this game, and probably if I look at like even old fighting games, most games, you want an unrealistic anticipation to the attacks, so that you have that feedback, the visual feedback of like winding up for the move and doing it. There's just something about it that, like, if you don't have that there, then a lot of the feeling of the power behind the move and satisfaction of doing it just kind of goes away. What we ended up having to do was really focus on the on like, if you're gonna punch, you pull your fist back, you do that, like twist your body back, and you really pull back in anticipation for the punch, all the time, for every move. And this that translated to the switchblade slashes and stabs and all that stuff. Even if it's really quick, you just have to. It's something you got to move through, and in order to get that feeling.
So if you were to design in your mind the perfect take on the mocap volume, right? You have a performer and you want them to do a melee combat move, and you're kind of imagining how this move should play out. How would you direct the performer to do the perfect take for you? That would be the best representation of what you then would need to work with. Also, bearing in mind the limitations of a performer, where on the volume, if I get asked to do a big anticipation, there's kind of a balance there, right? I can do a really big anticipation into a move, which takes longer, or I could give you a very fast anticipation into the move, which is going to be a smaller animation, but much quicker and might actually match the timing better. What do you think is what do you try and do as an animator and director?
I usually try and match game timing, as much as reasonably possible. So I think what you're kind of presenting is like, there's times when, if you're trying to nail something like that, you might have somebody say, well, don't worry about the timing. Let's make sure and hit the poses. We can compress and post. And the thing is, even if you try and match game timing, for example, we're still going to speed it up in post, most likely. So and it's going to be manipulated. If it's a player attack in particular, an enemy attacks, it's kind of it's a whole different equation. You know, especially, I mean, at least in those games, but I mean, I imagine it kind of translates to most of the games. And the reason being is, you know, you want to give the player the opportunity to have a response, be able to dodge, be able to evade if there's any backup, counterattack, whatever. You know, you don't. It's almost like you flip that whole paradigm on its head, and like you'd want the timing to maybe be longer than what you could realistically do, right? So in that case, so then you might have a little bit different direction, and that we really want to kind of draw out the anticipation and follow through and all of that, to give the player opportunity to make them feel powerful and like they can know what's going on. If you had, say, the same timing on the enemy as you did the player, it can be too challenging. The computer AI can think a lot quicker than people can.
How does that apply when you're doing finisher attacks? Because in the case of a finisher, it's not, once you engage the finisher attack, you're not then beholden to some kind of quick timing, right? You can then sort of slow down time. Do you find yourself animating differently for those?
Yeah, well, so in the case of Last of Us, yeah, I mean, and probably, I mean, I know like maybe God of War being an example, or a lot of action titles, they'll have like more cinematic, drawn out kind of animations to just enjoy once the enemy has reached a damage level of 0, basically, like and you're no longer necessarily under a threat. That's kind of how we treated it on The Last of Us. So even if you're in a room full of enemies that your enemy reaches 0, you now hit a strike, you basically sink, and at that point, and I think you basically make the player invulnerable. So and you do that, it's called play favoring, which is like so that you can just enjoy this moment without getting shot up or stabbed or something like while the animation is playing. So you don't want to penalize the player for you then trying to give them a cinematic moment. And there were things we did there, play with it, like you'd play shorter ones if there weren't people around, and if there's nobody around, you'd kind of do a longer one. So you have more freedom with the timing there. We had like general rules, if I remember correctly, as far as like how long they could be. I mean, there was definitely, like, as far as just duration of time, there were definitely we kind of identified what felt too long, and that all has to do with just the overall timing and pace, cadence of combat in the game. So it's not really a hard and fast rule. But as far as like the stuff we're talking about with like anticipation and follow through and things, you have more freedom, but at the same time, you don't want it to look out of place juxtaposed against everything else. So you want to feel like you're in the same universe. You want to feel like it's the same character doing this. So if we're just going to talk about something specific, like Ellie's switchblade moves, we did play with stuff like, because I think you look in real world, you look at like knife training, or there's like a thing I could call like a prison ship, where it's like, what do you do when you're really trying to take somebody out? You got a knife. What do? You stab them a lot. Right? Like trying to stab them a lot and poke them through holes. And so how do you do that? You do it as quick as you can. You can actually do it pretty quick. Like you look at, like a prison ship or something. They're not like doing these big slashes, are they? They're just getting in there and just yeah. And we tried stuff like it. It never felt right. It never felt. The thing is about it is if you hit the button once and you attack once, and then their health reaches 0, and then you hit the button once and they attack a bunch of times, that's another kind of factor that can make it feel a little detached from the rest of the experience. So you might have some free, you can have her do kind of like some sort of little combo that kind of flows naturally, where there's like one or two slashes. But once you got into like 3, 4, 5, you're just stabbing a bunch of times, or the same thing kind of goes for like punching a lot, or any kind of just if you're doing multiple strikes, if you're doing too many strikes off of one button press. At least with that, the way that the game design, all that stuff, didn't really feel. It just didn't feel right.
When you're then doing one of these synced attacks versus gameplay, what aesthetic are you trying to go for that would make a move look good?
No, when you ask that, the thing that comes to mind, and this is me personally, and it's kind of what I apply to, the style of, like, say, the games that I mentioned, and that's I think back to comic books. I don't think back to Toy Story. I will think back to things like Aeon Flux, though. Because Aeon Flux was more, there's anime, but it's not your like classic anime. It was like a real, the angles, I think about like screen composition, the contrapposto poses that you can hit in combat. With stuff like that, I've always thought about every frame. I want anyone to hit pause or take a screenshot and have it be a cool screenshot. And any frame should also be reasonably suggestive of what the action is happening at that time. And this is where I think like if we're thinking about movies, like where that might actually fall apart sometimes, like you can get in the action scenes and it's like you can just hit freeze frame and it's like you don't really know what's going on. But a finishing move, and all the finishing moves, but I did many on The Last of Us. That was kind of the style. I was thinking, we try to put a little roll in the camera, not too much. There's camera shake, of course, on impacts. You got some freedom with the camera, but I try to like think about like what a camera could really do. There's actually like camera guy in the scene. We've got somewhat traditional camera techniques, dollies and things. And so that's kind of it. General principles, like can I hit pause and take a screenshot and have it be like a cool little box in a comic book, basically.
I want to go back to when you're coming up with moves. I'm interested. What do you watch for inspiration for melee combat? Do you watch real life combat? Do you watch aesthetic, fictional combat?
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking at, and kind of what's in your head when you're going into animating characters?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on the project. I'll say that for The Last of Us, I actually got into watching the UFC. I watched a lot of like highlights, but I would actually watch the fights. I would go out and watch the fights on Saturday night, like go to the sports bar near me, and like just what like it kind of got into it a little bit, and because that's it. I got into it through looking for references for research. We really wanted to. The direction was, and what was we wanted it to feel as grounded and visceral and real as possible. So if like what it feels like to land a punch on somebody's face, like we wanted to, get that in the game as much as possible. So to me, you can watch action movies, sure, but they're not really punching each other. They're not really knocking people out. They're not. So where can you see that in real life? We're to be MMA, right? That's real. Beyond that, there was, except for the later games, because we were getting more into knife play, we got into disarms and stuff like that. That's when we actually brought in a little bit of outside help with choreography. And that's because it went beyond, mine. I don't have like a martial arts background at all. I thought that maybe might have played to my advantage a little bit on the first game, because we were really trying to get away from that. We didn't want anything that looked trained, really. We wanted it to be, back alley street fighting. But with the later games, we had, in the fiction, there's a little bit more training, suggested in the history of the characters, and so we thought about like Krav Maga style disarms and that kind of stuff. So So it helped to bring in some outside help there. So in that case too, I was, I'd watch everything. I watched everything Krav Maga I could find on YouTube. I watched a lot of knife training, knife defense, defending yourself against somebody else's knife, like all that stuff on YouTube. There was a game I was working on recently. I watched a lot of I think it was SAS. It was kind of interesting. It's like very effective, very like not and it's no like bells and whistles. It's just like how do you get people down on the ground, knock them out as quickly as possible, and like how to handle aggressive situations. So like so it kind of depends on the character and the fiction really. Going way back to like say Aeon Flux, for example. I mean that's totally sci-fi, anime, fiction, whatever, but it kind of could be anything. So that was, we're going over the top, roundhouse kicks and flips and all that stuff. So I was looking at whatever I could find online at that time. We actually had a little bit of mocap to work with. Yeah. So I mean, it just depends on what we're trying to convey as far as the character and fiction, and if the writer or directors make any specific reference to its style, which actually Krav Maga was like actually mentioned as a style for Abby in The Last of Us 2. So okay, well, if you say that, I'm going to go look at everything I can find in that style and see what we can get from it.
While you were talking about watching UFC, did you notice any change in how you perceive martial arts before and after doing this research and animation for Last of Us?
My conception of martial arts, as far as style, and we got to see a practical application of the styles and see what actually worked in real life. It was kind of it was a reality truth test. And again, I'm not like a scholar of martial arts by any means, but like what I would have known about it by then would have just been, kind of cursory knowledge through like movies or, what I've been exposed to through entertainment, really. And, I might have thought that like any, Aikido or like, karate or like, all this stuff would have been, that they would have been effective against an opponent in real life somewhat equally. And I think that what MMA showed us is it's not necessarily the case. There might be like aspects of those things you might be able to incorporate, but like what does it really come down to? It comes down to basically like boxing and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It's like striking and ground game, essentially. If you're in one-on-one with somebody, which I think is what I think, I don't know if I'm going to nail the styles, but what it'd be like kickboxing and jiu-jitsu, right? I mean, they get like, there's other stuff that kind of makes its way in there. I mean, because there's actually the UFC games, which the ones that I've seen, I played them way back then. There was like there was one, I think EA was behind it. I don't know. They got into like a lot of
extremely complex
graphics. It's really yeah, exactly. It's very, especially when you get into like the twists and turns of jiu-jitsu on the ground. It's just like with the controller they got. Yeah, it is very complex. And so stuff like that doesn't really held up in the context of like a long action game. So I'd say like my comment on that would be just, for me, I think I was just along for the ride with like the rest of the world. It was paying attention to what is effective in real life when it comes to fighting.
I wanted to go back to mocap. What do you look for in a performer when you're trying to direct melee combat movement?
Like quick, like fast twitch muscle response is important. We had in a period of time where we were actually doing, auditions for Last of Us 2. So we had a lot of female stunt actors come in, and there's a lot of, talented women that might have had been like more on the, I don't know, like gymnastics side of things, or like, done stunt work and stuff, but like you've seen them throw, punch and kick, and they didn't have like the fast twitch muscle response. That takes, that takes a lot of training, but that was kind of the one thing that can be a little tough to find, because it's again, it depends on the character and the fiction, I mean, if they're gonna be doing like flips and
Right.
stuff
Then you
like
have
that,
gymnastics
then you
ones.
need that, of course. For that game, we mostly just looked around at we looked at like, how do you move around the space, and then if you're gonna throw a punch and a kick, like what does that look like? I think that's like what we had, our auditions is pretty quick. It was just like run from here to there, here's a gun, how do you approach the space, like take cover, that kind of stuff.
So say you have, let's say you have a roster of very talented stunt performers who all are very fast twitch. What advice would you give them then to sort of maximize what they do on the volume for you? Like, how can they best help you? Because Krav Maga, I mean, why not just put the Krav Maga guys in mocap suits, right?
So, because I've done this too, like there's a difference between stunt actors that have all this training and have done a ton of mocap and done a ton of video games, and ones that haven't. It really comes down to, I mean, where like the ease of work, as far as like making our lives easier, it's like it comes down to kind of like a basic understanding of the structure behind typically how like video games work. Like just little things like hitting auto pose, making sure your feet are in generally the same spot. When you start and finish them, like that kind of basic stuff that you usually have to follow. You can teach that, but like I find that people that have done a lot of mocap, they've more internalized it, and I mean, you can teach it on the spot, but it's like I think it's stuff like that just kind of takes a little bit of time. And then like also internalizing the speed and hitting poses. That's something that like you say you get the Krav Maga guy, you might not get. And then again, like the anticipation, telegraphing moves, like making things feel like an action movie or a comic book rather than real life. You're doing the action that you're doing is the same action, but as far as like selling the impact, and the anticipation and follow through and speed, that's the type of stuff that, from my perspective, that where you can tell the difference of people who've done a lot of games versus not. They have the same background and training.
When you talk about posing, where in the timeline of a movement, I actually have two questions here. The first thing is that a movement itself has a structure to it as well. There's a beginning, middle, and end. And somewhere in there is a pose. In fact, you could probably pose all the way through it.
Uh-huh.
Where do you like the pose to be in the scope of that movement?
Well, typically poses are going to be, they're like beats. They're like an apex to curves, like of movements. So like say, when we're talking about anticipation mode pose and you pull your fist back to throw a punch, is where's the apex of the trajectory of your fist and your elbow and your shoulder and all that. That pose that you move through as you're shifting direction and movement is typically like, that's like the most kind of easy to see, definable pose. And because you're right, as you're moving, if you're moving it through an arc, you could kind of hit pause and that's a pose, but usually it's like, it's definable, like it usually is some kind of shift in movement. I think that's probably the more universal rule of like trying to visualize a pose inside of a movement is because I'm thinking, even if you were to say like swing a baseball bat, there's like, I mean, that's usually pretty smooth arc, but like maybe midway through is kind of the extension of how far out the bat goes before it comes back in. So that's a pose, because that's almost like a change of direction, And so when as animators, you kind of can think back to traditional animation, where back in the day when people were doing everything by hand, you had kind of a hierarchy of animators. You had key artists, like key pose, like literally like this, and we think of it a little bit like this today, but like the computers basically are in betweener. But like you still, when you hand key stuff, you go through and you work out key poses, and then it's gonna, the computers are gonna basically interpolate between those key poses, and then you work on it you kind of finesse the movements from there. But like back in the day, the big name animators, the ones that like the old guys at Disney, they'd shoot on twos, so they had like 12 frames of art for every second, but they might do 4 pieces of art for that second, and then they hand that down to the in-betweeners, and the in-betweeners would fill in that and define what the movement is in between those poses. So I think like that kind of concept of key poses in animation then boils its way up to this concept in live action on the stage in motion capture. We're trying to like digest it and see it in a way that you would have animated this stuff by hand.
I was going to ask, do you think that there was like a standard in timing for the Disney style animation and maybe American animation more broadly, where they would hit certain keyframes and that was just a standard of movement?
Yeah, I mean, there is. It's a little bit different, I think, with movies when we're talking about Disney or Pixar or any kind of like animated feature versus games, right? Because it's just that thing I was talking about earlier, where like we have responsiveness to think of. We have like the interactive experience factor that you don't have in animated features. So, but to answer the question about standard, then yeah, I think there's probably like a video game standard, and then there's like the movie standard. And as far as hitting poses and doing moving holds and all that kind of stuff, you've got like there's styles, but you can almost I think the early Disney guys did kind of define a style that carried its way through all the way through 3D and Disney movies, to this day. And that's Pixar has like a timing style with poses and moving holds and hitting key poses. When characters are acting, saying dialogue, and even doing action and stuff, I guess you could watch like Incredibles or something and like kind of compare and contrast that with games. I remember I did a test for Blizzard once, long ago, where the animation director, his reference he gave me was Kung Fu Panda. And so I watched the DVD of Kung Fu Panda, and I was like frame by framing Kung Fu Panda over and over again. I was trying to like transcribe like video game movements from Kung Fu Panda, which actually held up pretty well timing wise, because they were really quick and snappy about moves. So like maybe that that kind of timing and pose approach could translate to games fairly well. But I'd say like general games, and like it's going to be quick and snappy, although you've got of course a wide variance there depending on what the pacing and cadence of the game is like, because you've got plenty of games that are much slower paced. The player expectation for doing things just isn't there for them to be gaming as far as the timing is concerned.
I have one last question for you, Lee. Do you notice any difference between American style animation and Japanese style animation, whether it be anime or 3D animation, and how the difference in posing, for example, is is what I'm really getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, a scholar in anime, but I mean, I've got kind of cursory knowledge of stuff. As I've of course seen the big ones, old school Kira and stuff like that. In general, my observation would be that like they are much more focused on this concept of like making things look like a comic book in any single frame, like making it very dynamic, really pushing poses. And I believe typically in the old school animes, one of the key differences would be that they would shoot on fours, because it's like the art was so much more intricate, and it took so much more work that's why like you'd see just by nature shooting on fours, you're spending time on every pose, right? The human eye is like, we're not, it's no longer fooled by this quick procession of frames, and so we see less of the movement. You have to actually be a little bit more conscious about piecing the movement together in your head. If you're holding on each one of the poses, I don't know if they're still doing it these days, but I'm thinking back to like even just the silly stuff like Dragon Ball Z, even I'm not pretty sure like that's shot on fours. There's one that I was really into, Samurai Champloo. Yeah, I got that on Blu-ray. I watched it a few times years ago. Shot on fours, beautiful art, but it's like doing that on twos, I think like too much. So like, but that's how you get like when they they pull back and they do a sword swing, you get to see every step of the way. You get to spend time on every frame. Some of the feel, that's kind of like some of this for me, some of the signature feel behind any of the anime that I've seen.
Do you see any similarity within the 3D animation coming out of Japan? Fighting games like Tekken, Virtua Fighter.
Okay, games. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so that's that stuff I think is even like 60 FPS. And so they're like, but that's fighting games, side-scrolling fighting games. It's kind of a little bit of a different world. I mean, there's stuff that we learn from and use from fighting games, but I mean, that's like the responsiveness is everything. So usually you get like the time between hitting the button and making contact is like as short as they can possibly make it. They might not even get a frame of anticipation. If they do, it's one frame, just because of the nature of like fighting another human being and like, it's so it's a little bit different there. They do those hit stops.
And what about after the movement, the recovery after the movement? Do you notice anything with that that's different in these Japanese 2D fighters?
With like Tekken and stuff, I mean, it's quick. I think it's just all about being quick. They're very much on the nose with poses and just your hit stops. You get time. Basically, it's just pausing the game for a few milliseconds, so that everybody knows there's like damage that's been caused and there's no time penalties. But but you want it you got these combos and everything where you're just having very quick movements back to back. So it's just all about being quick, it seems. Quick and selling poses. It's like that's probably like one of the better, a good example of defining poses in a really short period of time.
Well, this has been awesome, Lee. It helps me as a performer to kind of get into your head and understand how you see movement. And I think that this information can also help, up and coming mocap performers and stunt performers, knowing how to translate real life training into motion capture for games.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for your insight, and your body of work is awesome. You're clearly very adept at this, despite the fact that you didn't train martial arts. It seems like all the training at the sports bar was worth it in the end.